December 9, 2018. Practicing Peace. Reverend Cheryl Paget. Given at Unity of Payson, Arizona.
Father George Sebekula was an Army chaplain back in 1945. And he had a reputation for being very, very gung-ho. Now, if you've been in the military like I have, you know what gung-ho means. In fact, behind his back, people would call him General George. And he got reprimanded for being so gung-ho. That's how gung-ho he was. Well, on August 9th of 1945, he was called down to the hangar with the other chaplains. And they were there to bless the bombers on their way. They blessed the airplane, they blessed the crew, and they blessed the bombs themselves. And they took off toward Japan. The first place that they were to go to was a place called, what was the name? Kokura, Japan. Now they had strict orders that they were not allowed to release those bombs until they had a visual sighting. And they had a list with them of all of the places that they could drop the bombs at. But the closer they got to Kokura, the more they noticed it was socked in. There was too much fog, and they looked for all of these targets, but they couldn't find a one of them. And they had already depleted some of their fuel. They decided to go on to the next target, Nagasaki. They went down their list of the targets in Nagasaki and found one and saw it visually and let go of the bombs. Well, that target happened to be the biggest Catholic church in all of Japan. And in one fell swoop, we were able to destroy what the Japanese government had been trying to destroy for 2,000 years. Well, the bombers went back, and they did what they did at that time, is they called in the chaplains so that they could say their confessions. And George Sebekula, who was Mr. Gung-Ho, started hearing about the target that they used. And he went home that night and he couldn't shake the feeling. He kept thinking about this huge cathedral, all of the nuns and priests and children, the schools and all the people around them. And this just ate away at him. And he had a crisis of faith. In fact, so much so, this bothered him so much so that after the war, he went over there. He wanted some type of connection, some type of understanding. Why was he feeling so conflicted? And he started going through the rubble. Now, this was ground zero, so there was hardly anything left. But as he sifted through the rubble, he found something. The top of an incense burner, you know, one of the ones that they swing. And I want to read to you what he wrote. He said, I walked through the ruins of Nagasaki right after the war and visited the place where once stood the Urakami Cathedral. I picked up a piece of censer, that top of the incense burner, from the rubble. When I look at it today, I pray that God forgives us for how we have distorted Christ's teachings and destroyed his world by the distortion of that teaching. I was the Catholic chaplain who was there when this grotesque process that began with Constantine reached its lowest point so far. Now this story intrigues me because of the transformation that he made. He went from Mr. Gung-Ho, General George, to starting up the Catholic pacifist movement. He went from someone who believed in enemies to someone who was really practicing what he had been preaching his whole life. And this experience made him take some time and really look into Jesus' teachings. In fact, he started to study again, all over again, what Jesus really meant when he talked about not resisting, about loving your enemies. This also reminds me of the story in the Bible of Paul. Well, actually, his name was Saul, and he was kind of the same way. He was very gung-ho about killing the disciples, about finding them and bringing them to justice. And he had that same kind of transformation, where all of a sudden the light hit him and his heart changed. He saw things differently. He understood from a different place what Jesus was trying to teach us. In fact, I love this. This is one of my favorite scriptures. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by what? Renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What is good and what is acceptable and what is perfect. And that all starts here. What we believe. When this happened to George and to Paul, they both started to understand that really we are all one. There are no real enemies other than the ones we make up right here. So as we start to grow and transform, I believe that truth takes root in our minds and it starts eating away at us until we finally open up to that place where we can accept what the truth is and accept where we are not really living the truth. So it's about starting right here. It's about starting in prayer and meditation and meditating on peace. George took that incense top home and he put it on his table. And he would constantly think about peace. Think about Jesus' teachings. And that is the renewal of our minds. Once we open up to it, and once we start focusing on it, everything changes. When I think of peacemakers during our time, one of the greats that I think of is Nelson Mandela. And he was 28 years in prison. 28. Can you imagine? And can you imagine the emotions that must build up? 28 years in prison. But I want to share with you what he said. He said, as I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. Our bitterness, our hatred, our having enemies is what blocks us from that inflow of peace, that divine nature that all of us have. And we want it and we desire it. But then our egos come in. And the fear comes in. Oh, they're out to get us. Oh no, we have to defend ourselves. Jesus taught that at the bottom, at the root, at the soul level, is that divine connection. And if we go there, that's when we can become the divine on earth. I love this from Matthew. Blessed are the peacemakers, because they will become children of God. And we can't have enemies and be peacemakers at the same time. It's not possible. So we have to go within and look at our fears. Look at our enemies. Look at our resentments. Lao Tzu said, there is no greater illusion than fear, no greater wrong than preparing to defend yourself, no greater misfortune than having an enemy. When I was in the military, I was sent overseas to Germany. And our enemy at the time were the Russians. I was in a combat squadron, so I was trained and I was constantly inundated with all of these things that, if they capture you, you know what they're going to do to you. You know what they do to women, right? And I'd say, no, what? Well, it's really bad. And then they talked about nuclear war. I would have nightmares about nuclear war, about the Russians. Well, fast forward about 20 years later, and I am in the adoption process. I am adopting my daughter. Guess where from? From Russia. So we come down into Moscow, and we land, and I look out of my windows, and here are soldiers dressed in military uniform coming to get our baggage. Instantly, I broke into a sweat and I started shaking, reaching for my gun. And I thought, oh boy, here it is. Here is a chance to heal this. Then we walked through the airport and there were soldiers all through the airport. And I was just breathing through all of it. Okay, God, whatever I need to learn, just bring it on. Well, we got to Moscow a little bit early so that we could tour. And one of the adoption agents volunteered to take us on this tour. And while we were in Moscow, we ran into her grandmother. And she introduced us. And when she introduced us, she introduced me as having been in the American military. This Russian woman's face got all crinkled up, and she started just bellowing out in Russian. I turned to this person and I said, "What's she saying?" "Oh, you don't want to know." And I said, no, I really do want to know. And she said, she wants to know why you want to kill all of us. She said that you don't know what it's like to have a war on your own land. And you see, I found out later that this woman was, during, I believe, the Second World War, her home was in Moscow, and so they had been surrounded. And she went to try to find some bread, and when she came back, the doors and windows had been all boarded up and set on fire, and she lost her entire family. But she said to me, "You don't understand. Why do you want to kill all of us?" And I thought, why do you want to kill all of us? And it came very clear to me that right then, that it's all about what we were thinking about each other. It was all about this fear that was an illusion. It wasn't based on anything. I don't want to kill anyone, and she didn't want to either. But this goes back to what our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, said. The source of all conflict is within our consciousness, regardless of its outer manifestation. Conflict is any and all opposing thoughts in consciousness. It all starts with what we believe. It all starts with where our enemies are. And we all have them. We all have people that we think are against us, and especially during this time when there's so much conflict in the world. So what do? How do we start living our principles? How do we start living first century Christianity? I'm not talking about the religion of Jesus. I'm talking about how he acted and what he taught. How do we start living that? Well, the first step is contemplate peace. I really like how George brought home that incense thing so that he would see it all the time, and it would remind him of peace, of what he really wanted to portray, that he wanted to be a peacemaker. And our third principle says that thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. So if we want to create a consciousness of peace, we have to contemplate it. We have to think about it. We have to meditate on it. And the second thing that we have to do is to let go. I have a little visual about surrendering and letting go. It is giving my keys up of the executive bathroom to CEO of the universe. I cannot control what other people think. I cannot control what other people do. I can only control what I do. And to do that, you have to let go. And so when you feel that little irritation that that person is causing conflict in my life, surrender. They're going to do what they're going to do. But we can either respond out of fear or out of peace and love. Which leads me to the next thing. Avoid those things that take peace away from you. Facebook. See, because I've had such a varied career, I have a lot of different friends with a lot of different opinions. And sometimes they like to post them on Facebook. Do you have any of those? And they are directly opposite of mine. And so the first thing that I really love to do is go to factcheck.org and prove them wrong. And I did that a couple of months ago with a very dear friend of mine. And I posted right underneath his post, "This is fact check, it's not true." And you know how he responded to me? He said, "I don't care if it's true or not, I'm going to believe it." So I had to go back to my principles. Okay. What went wrong there? Well, I felt I had to show him the right way. Because I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I think that these people that think opposite of me are going to suddenly say, "Oh, that post that you put out there, Cheryl, that changed my mind. You're changing political parties." Said no one ever. But we have this idea that we are going to change minds. So I went back to my belief system. Okay, focus on, how can I be a peacemaker here? Maybe say, "You know what, I love you. I love you. We disagree, I still love you." And let it go. And just allow him to be him. Okay? But we have a lot of things in our lives that block us from feeling that peace. It may be the news, social media, maybe certain people. So when we find ourselves getting off track, when we find ourselves making up enemies in our heads, then we sometimes need to just remove ourselves from that. Shut off the television. Walk away from the computer. The Dalai Lama said, "It is essential to know that to be a happy person, a happy family, a happy society it is very crucial to have a good heart. And that is very crucial. World peace must develop from inner peace. Peace is not just the absence of violence, but the manifestation of human compassion. And so after we remove ourselves away from whatever it is that's blocking us from that connection, we start to practice compassion. We start to think, how do those people feel? We start to open up our hearts and see them as connected to us, as part of the whole. We stop separating ourselves. And we can do that in very small ways. It might just be a smile. It might be a hug. It might be just saying, hey, I love you. But peace has to be practiced in this world, or else we're not going to have a world of peace. So we must practice what we preach. We have to practice peace, and we do that by being compassionate, opening up our hearts, trying to see from another standpoint. And when we do that, everything changes. One of my congregants from up in Show Low went to be in a peaceful protest. And for some reason, they have the protest right next to a store that sells goods from the opposite political party. And there was a man standing there with a loaded AR-15. And he started yelling. He started yelling some really nasty things about different people in the past. And my friend started feeling that irritation and that fear come up. He's standing there with a gun. And as they started to disperse and she started to walk, she walked by him. And then she stopped. And she turned and walked up to him and put her arms around him. And just hugged him. And all of a sudden, she heard in her ear a whisper where he said, you know what? We want the same things for this country. What a wonderful realization. That is practicing compassion. So this week, I invite you to contemplate peace. And an affirmation that you can use, and I love to use acronyms, that's my military background, is I practice empathy and compassion everywhere. Can we say that together, please?
I practice empathy and compassion everywhere.
So let's start that practice today. Let's open our hearts up to transform, to really start to practice peace, to feel peace, to feel that connection with the divine. When you transform yourself, you transform the whole world. Peace starts with each one of us.